Asian markets opened with cautious optimism today as investors brace for what could be one of the most consequential weeks in monetary policy this year. But beneath the surface of this seemingly routine market activity lies a brewing storm that has everything to do with Donald Trump's increasingly desperate attacks on Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, and how his own policies might be sabotaging the very economic relief he's demanding. The stage is set for Wednesday's Federal Reserve meeting, where markets are pricing in a virtual certainty of the first rate cut in nearly a year. The benchmark interest rate has remained at 4.25% to 4.50% since December. But here's where Trump's strategy appears to be completely backfiring. In congressional testimony in July, Powell said the Fed would have already cut rates this year if Trump had not implemented his major tariff policy. Let that sink in for a moment. The very man who has been calling on Powell to lower the Fed's short-term interest rate and said, Powell's termination cannot come fast enough, is the same person whose policies are preventing those rate cuts from happening. It's a masterclass in self-defeating economic policy that would be comedic if it weren't so consequential for millions of Americans.
The tragic consequence of demonizing those with whom you disagree day after day, year after year, in the most hateful and despicable way possible. For years, those on the radical left have compared wonderful Americans like Charlie to Nazis and the world's worst mass murderers and criminals. This kind of rhetoric is directly responsible for the terrorism that we're seeing in our country today, and it must stop right now. My administration will find each and every one of those who contributed to this atrocity and to other political violence, including the organizations that fund it and support it, as well as those who go after our judges, law enforcement officials, and everyone else who brings order to our country. From the attack on my life in Butler, Pennsylvania last year, which killed a husband and father, to the attacks on ICE agents, to the vicious murder of a healthcare executive in the streets of New York, to the shooting of House Majority Leader Steve Scalise and 3 others, radical left political violence has hurt too many innocent people and taken too many lives. Tonight, I ask all Americans to commit themselves to the American values for which Charlie Kirk lived and died, the values of free speech, citizenship, the rule of law, and the patriotic.
This pattern of contradictory behavior extends beyond just monetary policy. Trump's rhetoric has become increasingly unhinged, with him recently stating, "But we have a guy that's just a stubborn mule and a stupid person that is making a big mistake." This isn't just unpresidential behavior, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how central banking works and why Fed independence matters. The irony becomes even more stark when you consider the economic data that's actually driving Fed policy. The Bureau of Labor Statistics routinely revises its jobs numbers each August, but this year's adjustment is unexpectedly severe. From March 2024 to March 2025, the U.S. added about 911,000 fewer jobs than previously reported, a much larger downward move than economists feared. The White House has already seized on the revisions as evidence that Joe Biden's economy was a disaster, that the fact-finding agency itself is in disarray, and that President Trump is right about the Federal Reserve being too late. But here's what Trump conveniently ignores. His own policies are creating the very conditions that make rate cuts impossible. The Fed chair also noted that its policymakers want to hold off on making any moves until the effects of Mr. Trump's economic policies become clearer, such as the impact of his broad tariffs on inflation and economic growth. The Fed isn't being too late. It's being prudent in the face of Trump's reckless trade war. The Asian markets that opened cautiously today understand something Trump apparently doesn't. Central bank credibility matters more than political pressure. The Fed's independence allows it to pursue its dual mandate, to keep inflation low and the labor market at full employment, without pressure from elected officials, economists say. Nations with central banks that move interest rates at the whim of politicians tend to have inflation spikes and other economic troubles, experts have noted. Trump's threats have escalated beyond mere criticism.
Trump, the MAGA movement, and Charlie Kirk was really at the heart of all of that. He is credited with a huge portion of Trump's win in 2024. He was on the ground. He created an entire system to get young voters out and excited and enthusiastic about Trump. And it's not just as though he was some kind of outside influencer. He was very close to the president himself. I know specific examples of times that the two of them went back and forth over various issues. When Charlie thought something was important to the MAGA base, he brought it to the president's attention. There are some people who believe that Charlie had his finger on the pulse of Trump's base more than even some of his own cabinet officials. He had a huge following and, again, was so close to the family, to President Trump himself. And one of the things, I continue to bring up is the fact that there was a lot of conversation during the transition as to potentially making Charlie Kirk part of the administration.
President Donald Trump on Tuesday threatened to allow a major lawsuit against Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell to proceed, escalating his pressure on the central bank leader to cut interest rates. Trump said in a Truth Social post that the suit would relate to Powell's management of pricey renovations at the Fed's headquarters in Washington, D.C., which the president has previously criticized. This isn't just about interest rates, it's about the fundamental structure of American economic governance. It's a lesson that we learned from the 70s that doing so and forcing the Fed to be beholden to elected politicians can lead to inflation. It can lead to weakness in the dollar and just bad trade-offs for the economy. So it's a dangerous zone that we're in. The markets are responding to this uncertainty in predictable ways. Mr. Trump's repeated pressure on Powell to lower rates could have the opposite effect, noted Will Denier of investment advisory firm Gavacal Research. The Fed must avoid any appearance of bowing to Trump's pressure for rate cuts, which would further undermine shaky confidence in U.S. institutions. What's particularly galling about Trump's attacks is how they reveal his complete misunderstanding of current economic conditions. Mr. Trump on Thursday inaccurately claimed there is virtually no inflation. Inflation rose 2.4% on an annual basis in March, which reflects a cooler pace than in the prior months, yet is still above the Fed's stated goal of reaching a 2% annual pace. The global implications of Trump's Fed interference extend far beyond American borders.
If they stop buying Russian oil. Moscow said this week that negotiations to end the war in Ukraine are going nowhere. It also comes just days after Russian drones were shot down inside Polish airspace. We've got full coverage of these developments. With us now is CNN senior White House reporter Betsy Klein and correspondent Nada Bashir in London. Betsy, to you first. Is this another shift in the relationship between the president and NATO allies?
Well, it could mark a shift, but President Trump issuing a major ultimatum to these NATO countries, saying that the U.S. is ready to apply major sanctions on Russia only if NATO countries agree to do the same and to stop buying Russian oil. He said this in a letter to these countries issued earlier this morning. And the president also said in that letter that those countries should significantly ramp up those tariffs on China to 50 to 100%, marking a major show of force. But meeting President Trump's demands would mark a major shift in policy for these NATO countries. It's really unclear at this point if there is going to be collective interest in taking these steps. But I want to read to you from the president's letter. He says, quote, NATO's commitment to win has been far less than 100%, and the purchase of Russian oil by some has been shocking. It greatly weakens your negotiations.
In the short term, changes in market expectations may lead to increased volatility in the stock market. Investors may overreact to changes in various factors, thus triggering large stock market shocks. China, in particular, is watching this drama unfold with keen interest. The depreciation of the US dollar compared to the Chinese currency RMB may create pressure on the Chinese export industry, where firms find themselves less competitive in terms of price in the international market. This may, in turn, lead to increasing pressure on the revenue of exporters, which in turn may affect the stock price of those firms. The Bank of Canada is also expected to cut rates this week, creating a complex international monetary policy environment. But unlike Trump's approach with the Fed, Canadian policymakers operate without the constant barrage of personal attacks and threats that characterize Trump's relationship with Powell. Perhaps most revealing about Trump's Fed strategy is how it exposes his administration's economic contradictions. Trump complained that interest rates are still rising because we have a Federal Reserve chairman that is playing politics. Yet longer-term rates rose after Trump announced his trade penalties. Trump and members of his economic team have said they would like longer-term interest rates to fall, which would make it cheaper for Americans to borrow to buy homes, cars, and appliances. The housing market, which Trump claims to be defending, is actually being hurt by his own policies. Could somebody please inform Jerome Too Late Powell that he is hurting the housing industry very badly? People can't get a mortgage because of him, Trump wrote on his Truth Social platform. But mortgage rates are influenced by long-term rates, which have risen partly due to Trump's tariff policies creating inflationary pressures. Market veterans are warning about the dangers of Trump's approach. That's the kind of consideration that has market veteran Ed Yardeni wondering about the wisdom of another round of cuts as he worries that Powell might be wrong about the temporary impulse of inflation from Trump's tariffs. The Fed won't listen to me. Of course, they'll do what they're going to do, the head of Yardeni Research said Monday on CNBC. The cautious tale is what happened last year when the Fed lowered by 100 basis points and the bond yield went up 100 basis points. The irony is that if Trump truly wanted lower rates, he would stop implementing policies that force the Fed to keep them high. Powell has pointed to concerns about tariffs pushing inflation further away from the Fed's 2% target rate as the reason for holding off rate cuts. Instead, Trump has chosen the path of public confrontation and personal attacks. As Asian markets navigate this uncertainty, they're pricing in not just the likelihood of rate cuts, but the broader implications of a politically compromised Federal Reserve. Markets see a more than 80% chance of a Fed rate cut in September, but the odds may be closer to 50-50 due to strong economic indicators. Solid GDP growth, stable financial conditions, and low market volatility reduce pressure on the U.S. central bank to ease monetary policy. Also, inflation remains above the Fed's target and is fueling concerns among consumers, further complicating the case for a rate cut. The global financial system depends on the credibility and independence of major central banks. Trump's attacks on Powell aren't just damaging to American economic policy, they're undermining confidence in the entire international monetary system. Lisa Shallett, Chief Investment Officer at Morgan Stanley, believes that despite the enormous political pressure the Fed faces and acknowledging some problems in labor market data, the justifications for cutting interest rates are insufficient at this time. She wonders what problem the Fed sees that warrants such urgent intervention. What makes Trump's Fed strategy particularly short-sighted is how it will backfire in the long term. And Chair Powell is not the kind of man that will necessarily bow to that pressure, but his term only lasts through May of next year. And then President Trump gets to name his replacement. Even if Trump succeeds in replacing Powell, the damage to Fed credibility could take years to repair. The markets understand what Trump apparently doesn't. That central bank independence isn't an obstacle to economic growth. It's a prerequisite for it. There's virtual unanimity among economists that monetary independence from political interference, that the Fed or any central bank be able to do the job that it needs to do, is really important, Austan Goolsbee, Chicago Federal Reserve Bank president, said in an April interview with CBS News, Face the Nation with Marguerite T. Brennan. As Wednesday's Fed meeting approaches, the world will be watching not just for the rate decision, but for how Powell responds to Trump's unprecedented pressure campaign. The Fed's credibility, and by extension, the stability of the global financial system, hangs in the balance. Trump's Fed fury reveals everything wrong with his approach to economic policy: short-term thinking, personal attacks instead of substantive policy, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how institutions work. His demands for rate cuts while simultaneously implementing policies that make those cuts impossible isn't just hypocritical, it's economically destructive. The Asian markets that opened cautiously today understand something Trump doesn't. In the complex world of global finance, credibility matters more than bluster, and institutional independence matters more than political pressure. Trump's Fed strategy isn't just failing, it's actively undermining the economic recovery he claims to want. As this monetary policy drama unfolds, one thing is clear: Trump's attacks on Powell have backfired spectacularly, creating the very economic uncertainty and policy paralysis that higher interest rates are designed to prevent. The question now isn't whether the Fed will cut rates, but whether American economic institutions can survive Trump's assault on their independence.